Welcome everybody to this after lunch session. My name is Joanne Evans. I'm an archival and record keeping scholar from Monash University, and a pleasure to be the moderator of today's session as the coordinator of the Records Continuum Research Group. As the title and the abstract for this session suggests, we're looking to stir things up a little, so please tap into your inner angry archivist, and particularly because this is the sleepy session and we've just had a lovely lunch, yes, we thought this is a good timing to kind of keep people alert, awake and on their toes to lead us into the rest of the program for today. So, to start things off, we're going to do things a bit differently. I'm going to hand over to two of our panellists, Lydia and Susannah, to set the scene, and then it'll back to me to introduce them, the rest of the panel, before we dive into our discussion. So, over to Lydia and Susannah.
Okay. Ooh. Got my newbie cup.
Yeah. Hi, Susannah. You're a couple of weeks into your first job in record keeping. It must be exciting for you to be doing the things you learned about at university. How are you finding it so far?
It sure is, Lydia. A lot of things from my course have really clicked into place now, like using an RDA. There's some things from my course that I haven't really used or seen people using, though.
Oh, tell me about it. Last week I heard about an office that was receiving emails and then printing them out. They'd collect the printouts, then scan to PDF, then attach them to a file in their EDRMS. It was a bit strange.
Speaking of email, this morning I tried to register an email thread, born digital of course, with 3 authors, but our EDRMS only let me put in 1 author. There must be an issue. How do we get it fixed?
I'm a newbie too. I don't think I can answer that one for you. Have you thought about calling the Records Continuum hotline? I found a flyer for it the other day.
Ooh, let me get out my phone. Ah.
Records Continuum hotline, Cath speaking. How may I help you?
There's an issue with our EDRMS. It doesn't have a spot to put in multiple authors in a document for co-creation.
Okay, well maybe just take a deep breath first. Oh dear, Susannah, I have something to break to you. There's sometimes a bit of a disconnect going on between what they might teach you in Records and Archives school and what happens on the ground. Your EDRMS is not broken. That's how it was designed. You can only put in 1 author for each document. You're going to find a lot of differences between your education in record keeping and what happens in the workplace. Let me give you some advice.
So, just to get you thinking, so now I'll introduce you to our panel. First off, we have Susanna Tyndall, a new record-keeping professional. She completed a graduate diploma in Information and Knowledge Management at Monash University, specialising in archives and records in 2016. And since finishing her graduate diploma, Susannah has completed 2 short-term contracts at the University of Melbourne with the Melbourne Dental School, School of Psychological Sciences. Again, a very familiar experience for many of us when we were starting out in the field. And she's also gained experience through volunteering at the Victorian Public Records Office. And since April 2017, she's been a records officer for Monash University. So if we could put our hands together to welcome Susannah. Next we have Lydia Laurenti, who works in digital record keeping at Monash University, providing advice to staff on effective and compliant record keeping. She is studying a graduate diploma in Information and Knowledge Management at Monash, which is no mean feat, as we know to combine part-time study with full-time work is a challenge, and again many of us have probably had that experience as well too. And her reflections on that experience has actually been a bit of an inspiration for this panel. Lydia has already shown herself to be a creative and committed young professional, leading a winning hackathon team on big analytics at the Monash University Hackamon, and co-presenting last year at the International Council on Archives Congress in Seoul and a workshop on information cultures. So please welcome Lydia. Next, I'll actually go to the end first. We have Cath Nicholls, currently the Records Manager at Monash University and juggling doctoral research in the Faculties of Education and IT at Monash on top of her demanding day job. And I'll, a little conflict of interest, or I'm actually one of Cath's PhD supervisors, and I'm continually impressed at the way that she's handled that and exploring a really exciting topic, which I think will come out in the conversation today. Cath has over 20 years of working in tertiary education records management at both Monash and also this university here at Melbourne, overseeing some significant transformations in that time, which I think will also come out in the conversation. So please welcome Cath. And then our fourth panellist, indeed a great pleasure to have Judith Ellis, owner of Enterprise Knowledge and over 30 years' experience in the information and knowledge management field throughout Australia, Asia and the Pacific. She's chair of an ISO technical committee on archives records management, a member of Standards Australia Committee, ISO Task Force, technical coordination group on management system standards, which I guess picking up on what was talked about in the session before lunch, that issue of actually how record-keeping standards are used by non-record keeping professionals in framing their work. So she's a leader of that national and sector work on record-keeping compliance and a co-leader of that management systems for record standards. She's been to many professional conferences, has lots of publications, edited 3 books, involved with Australian universities in teaching, course development, and is the chair of the advisory board of the Centre for Organisational and Social Informatics at Monash University. So please welcome Judith. Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of background on this panel. At the Records Continuum Research Group, once a month we have a video conference where those who can just spend an hour on a Friday morning. We have a web conference software called Zoom. So we Zoom together and just have a little bit of a chat, find out what people have been doing, and then perhaps, ponder a continuum question. And I guess one of the questions we were pondering was what might we do as a group for the ASA conference coming up here in Melbourne. And we were also talking about the radical record-keeping ideas, and somehow in the course of that conversation we talked about being angry. And so as you can see from the description there, it kind of connected together in looking at the Angry Penguins, the cluster of self-professed angry and avant-garde visual and literary artists from the 1940s in Australia who challenged the existing establishment and ways of doing things. So we've drawn inspiration on that within the context of record keeping and archiving, wanting to kind of have a constructive dialogue about the gaps between what we know should be happening and what we actually have to face on a day-to-day basis. So it's about disrupting the status quo of outdated or dysfunctional record-keeping practices by bringing to bear the formation and use of archives in the continuum as to what that means conceptually, but then how that does and doesn't play out in practice. So I think that was also inspired by Cath's experience with Susannah and Lydia of sort of that hearing about what they were thinking about how they translate what they've learnt in the course into practice, and so that's how the idea for this session was born. So some of the questions that we're going to look at are those gaps between record-keeping education and training and professional practice, how they impact on new professionals. Do our conceptualisations help us to bridge those gaps? How do we use them practically? And I guess being about how new professionals come in and use this, I guess, because they are the future of our profession, in teaching, I sort of talk to students about the fact that, you know, I want you to come out of the course knowing enough about existing practices to be able to function as a new graduate, but I also want you to have the skills to be able to transform the profession and take it where it needs to be. So this is what we want to sort of talk about today. So I'm going to start off by asking all of our panellists to just tell us a little bit about their careers to date and how they've ended up on the panel today. So I'll start with you, Susanna.
Thank you. So I'm definitely a new graduate. I've realised today is my 5-month anniversary of my Monash job, so it's a little bit exciting for me. Only graduated at the end of last year. Before that, I was working in retail while I was studying, and that's definitely given me a lot of background for this job, a lot of customer experience and things like that. Definitely what I studied while I was in my undergrad, I did a Bachelor of Arts where I did history, sociology and politics, and definitely those kinds of fields have gone well into studying archiving and record keeping.
Thanks, Susanna. Lydia?
Okay, so my background, my first career was actually in sales and marketing for the health and fitness industry. So in some respects, I'm not quite sure how I ended up here. But when I think back, I did a lot of record keeping and data management, not really being able to articulate that that's what I was doing. I did a range of roles in governance at a university, so related compliance areas like privacy. And I had a role that had a fair bit of record keeping in it. So I had to learn on the job, and I got interested, and then I decided if I'm going to do this, I should probably actually get a qualification in it. So I think it was a bit unusual these days for the new sort of generation, where I started doing the job, learned how to do record keeping, but didn't really know why we do it a certain way. So I signed up for a course to learn that, and now I feel that I'm learning more about the why, which will put me in good stead for you know, more policy and strategy type roles.
Thanks, Lydia. And yeah, falling into record keeping is a very common story that I know I fell into record keeping. It's like as well too, where you're feeling you have an affinity for this kind of information stuff, but you're not quite sure about it, and then suddenly, luckily, find yourself in a space where you can explore that, as the title of Vern's keynote this morning, that passion for archives and records. So Judith.
Yes, I fell in too. From doing an honours degree in political science and economics, I was going to be an international journalist. But the graduate recruitment scheme fell in a heap at that time, and so I joined National Archives on a graduate recruitment scheme and spent 3 or 4 years there, 1 year of which was travelling overseas with a snail backpack on my back. So I did that for 3 or 4 years and then set up my own business, and that's what I've been doing for more years than I care to remember. Started doing some teaching at Monash, and then was sort of told, well, you shouldn't really be teaching this if you don't have the qualification. So I went back to school and did a master's in information management, also a certificate in assessment of quality management systems as well. A number of years ago. Started a PhD, that fell apart too. Work, travel, needing to improve my golf handicap. So moved that on a bit. I've been associated with Monash for a number of years, as you've heard, and other universities in teaching and in other roles with Monash. Long involvement in standards, both at the local level in terms of governments, state and territory governments, whole of government work, national and international. Why I'm on this panel, I've been around a long time, and I'm a practitioner. And while I do a lot of teaching and course development and so on, I am a practitioner. And in a consultancy role, I guess you're fighting all the time to be heard and have people take notice of you. And so often you see them pay for a report and then stick it in the top drawer or on a drive and lose it and ask you to give it back to them again in 2 or 3 years' time. But I've seen it all, I've heard all the difficult stories, and I see how we, in a range of practitioner roles, try to make a change. That's probably why I'm here.
Thanks, Judith. And I believe you were in the first intake for the Archives and Records Masters, and I think, yes, with Bruce Smith, Gavin McCarthy, yes, the first teaching with Frank. upwards, so...
I'm still only 36.
Yes, you were very young to be in that class. And finally, Cath.
Okay, yes, I was also schooled by Frank Upwood, who's in the back there, and Barbara Reid and Sue McKemish, and Lydia. So I did straight out of Bachelor of Arts into the course, being taught by the Continuum experts, and then I went into my first job at Monash Uni sort of straight. So I was very, very fortunate in that career. I started in archives at Monash Archives, and then went to Melbourne Uni and got into the records management side while still being considered an archivist. So I was practicing Continuum. And I stayed there for 10 years. During that time, I also had a 12-month secondment, or sort of a secondment sort of thing, where I was working in a provincial archives of New Brunswick in Canada, which was great because it just got me out of the uni sector for a nanosecond. And then I came back and continued came back to Monash University, where I'm currently the records manager. With my education, Bachelor of Arts, Master of Information Management and Systems, I've also done a Master's in Education, in Early Childhood Education in recent years, and my PhD is in Education and also Faculty of IT, where I'm combining my interest in early childhood education with record keeping and looking at looking at record keeping literacy and how that is influenced by early childhood education, and particularly looking at family record keeping around the child, which I'm really enjoying at the moment. So how I ended up here was probably because of the PhD, and I'm on that group that Joanne mentioned at the start, but also I guess too I've got as Joanne also mentioned, to new professionals in my group. So I'm in that position where I can see them, as Joanne mentioned, translating what they've learnt into what they're doing, and some of that dialogue that goes back and forth, and working with them on that.
Great. Okay, so we'll start off with some questions for Susannah and Lydia. Yes, I guess a big one. How well do you think your formal education has prepared you for your first professional archives and records job?
You can start if you want. So I might start, but I'm in a situation where I started working in record keeping before I started studying it. But at that point, I had a lot of transferable skills, a lot of related compliance areas. So what I found really interesting about the course that I'm doing at the moment, and very close to finishing, a grad dip in info and knowledge management accredited by the ASA, is that it really explains all the theories and the why we do it a certain way. So everything started to make sense. Like, I'd just been following sort of processes and procedures. I'd read the entire Public Records Office of Victoria website and sort of tried to do what they told me to do. But now I feel that learning about standards and theories and things, I feel like I'm more capable of being able to set the agenda or see why we do certain things away, and also question what we are currently doing. A lot of what we do in practice doesn't necessarily align to what I'm learning, and I think the problem is we need to change what we're doing.
I'm probably a little bit the opposite of Lydia, because I didn't mention before, I should have. I also fell into record keeping. I pretty much went into the course. I remember the very first day there would have been about 17 of us sitting around a table going, "Why have you chosen to study this course?" And I said, I don't really know, but I like the idea of it. I've been volunteering at Prov, and I like the artefacts, which we're not supposed to, but I do like them. Yeah, and then so I pretty much went into the course not really knowing what to expect, but getting all of that theory and everything like that, and thinking, oh, I wonder how all this is going to actually apply in the real world setting. I remember there was a class we did last semester that we learnt how to use Trim, but the version of Trim was the web client, if anyone uses that. And that's being like, oh, is this what a real life record keeper does? And then actually going into the real world and going, oh, this is so much better. Yeah. So I think the main thing was having all that theory behind you for the practical work.
Right, yes. So I guess could you pinpoint a couple of particular gaps that have that you've been struggling with, it's like, yes. Yeah.
Probably for me, I think I do learn, it's good to have all that theory basis behind me and go, yeah, I think I understand this, and then when you actually go and do real world and go, everything kind of sets in. I know I mentioned at the start the RDA because, sorry to Vivian who's in the audience who taught me about RDAs, it all made sense, and then I actually got to use it. I was like, oh, okay, this is fun. I think I need that practical application as well. Yeah.
And for me, one of the potential gaps in the course, I feel, is that it covers a lot of theory, and that helps you understand why you do record keeping. But something I'm noticing is I actually draw a lot in my current professional practice as a record keeper. I draw a lot on the skills and experiences from when I worked in sales and marketing and customer service. So yes, you need to understand how record keeping works and why you do it a certain way, but to be able to get your seat at the table for those meetings and start to get people on board and understanding, you actually need to know about customer service, following up leads, negotiation, all those sort of things. So it could just be more a limitation that I'm doing the grad dip, it's a 1-year course, but it would be good to see more of those sort of negotiation and leadership and sort of the people skills being a chance to use and learn more of that in the education. And for it to be valued in the education, I think we'll see it come into practice more.
Yes, it is a particular struggle in that the grad dip is only a 1-year course, and there's just so much that has to be covered within that space, sort of the technical skills, the technical knowledge and skills to actually have that space to explore those other skills. And it was again in teaching the professional practice unit that we have at Monash, where we had panels of people coming in from industry to talk about their experiences, and it was those soft skills that were highlighted over and over and over again as to the importance of that. And I think it is that issue of that you've talked about in your past, when you come and do this postgraduate qualifications, perhaps I guess one of the strategies was to sort of look at how people could draw on where that had come from their prior education and sort of see how they could connect with that, and then also to then encourage them to take on that as a professional development thing, that, you know, you're hearing from people who have been in the profession for a number of years of the importance of these skills. They're not in your course, so how do you therefore look for opportunities to get them? And one of them would be putting your hand up for being on a panel for a conference like this to practice that. Yes, yeah. So I guess, is there any particular strengths from the study that, I mean, you've probably highlighted that the conceptual stuff but is there anything particular that you'd like to point out about that? Yeah.
Just on a side note, I think absolutely the professional practice unit was invaluable, just the skills and everything like that. Almost, I would prefer if we did a second one as well in a different kind of industry. I think that would be, yeah, fantastic.
And for me, there was a unit where we really used the record-keeping standards in the assessment pieces. So we had to read and understand, you know, ISO 15489, the records management key one, but there were lots of other related ones to do with records management, assessing whether a business system is record-keeping compliant. There was one about classification schemes and things. So for me, I'd sort of been using some of those tools, like in my work I would use a classification scheme to give advice to staff on how to title their records in TRIM and the EDRMS, but actually learning why it's done a certain way again helped me give better advice to staff, because I was more confident and knowledgeable about where that advice draws from.
No, I'm going to ask a question that's not on the on our list. It's like, hopefully I don't want to throw you, but it is the fact that at Monash, it's not, you're not doing subjects with people who are going to be record-keeping professionals. You're doing subjects with people who are going to be IT and other kinds of information systems professionals. So what's that like in the course? Is that a help or a hindrance, or a bit of both?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because there's sort of two things I'm thinking of when I hear that question, because it's already implying that there are people in the course who maybe already have their discipline hat on, but I would sort of throw back that a lot of people in the course are actually doing the full masters that qualifies them as both a record keeping and archivist and as a librarian, or maybe a more broader information knowledge professional. So for me it's been kind of interesting because I have come in really specialised and honed in. I always say I'm here as a record keeper, and I think that maybe is a little rarer because there are a lot of librarians in the course, and comes back to glamour convergence of we have a lot of similarities with other professions, but I think going in as a record keeper, working as a record keeper, and always coming back to that in the class discussions, it helps me realise that we do have our own distinct professional identities within glamour. With a lot of similar skills and interests there, but it is okay to say, yep, this is my profession, this is the one I'm doing.
So yes, you've got quite a singular understanding, it's like, of what you're doing, but you're seeing other people who are looking more generally, it's like, that you're interacting with. And so I guess, are you being a bit of an advocate for record keeping in that space already? Yeah.
Well, and actually what I found interesting was I had a similar experience to Susannah, where in the first unit or the first week you sort of go around and say, you know, why are you doing the course? And I actually found myself a little bit, I don't know if alienated or isolated if they're the right words, but I usually tended to find myself as the only person identified as a record keeper in the course. The other people who were doing the exact same course as me to qualify as an archivist / record keeper, it's the same course, they often went in with their archivist hat on, but I'm not sure, I found most people in the course didn't have much or any professional practice, so I wonder if it's that thing of they might be drawn to the profession initially with an interest in history or an interest in artefacts, I do wonder maybe at the end of the course whether they're still strictly identifying as an archivist, or whether they've been sort of wowed by the, by the record keeping stuff.
I guess for that, we were just wondering if there was any newbies in the audience who are close to their education who might like to make a comment or two, and this is where I get to do some exercise and come and bring in the microphone. Yeah.
I'll talk more about my background a bit later on down to talk in the next session. I've finished my Masters from Charles Sturt Uni. I went through there, and I'm just about to finish a grad certificate, so I'll pick up the records and archives electives that way. One of the biggest challenges, I'm not sure you guys face being based in the city, but when you're not based in the city, in terms of actually getting the practical component of any course, it's really quite challenging. I grew up and was living in rural New South Wales, and I did a lot of my coursework, and it's all done online, so you don't actually get a chance to go in. And one of the biggest challenges I've found is actually getting the practical skills, using the computer programs, those sorts of things. Having never come out of that industry before, that was one of the biggest gaps that I see in terms of getting that experience, because when you read the job ads, they go, experience in this, and you go, I can tick that one, oh, whoops, no, can't tick that one, is it worth going for? Because when you get rejected so many times, you've got to wonder whether you waste your time putting in for something that you probably won't get, or won't even get an interview to get a chance to sell yourself on that front. Yeah, very challenging. I worked in the last place, I worked in terms of a government agency. They vowed and declared that trim would be introduced. We got whacked around the head several times before Christmas, told them we had to do the training. They restructured the place, and I lost my job about 6 months later. That was June, and I still hadn't actually implemented trim. So, I mean, the other side of the coin too is that you're saying, I can understand how the problems arise when there's not actually the support there too of people in the actual industry as well. So I can see how the problems arise, and I know what happens when you get that sort of lack of stuff as well. So it's a bit of both.
Okay, well, I think that probably segues quite nicely into the next question for our older... actually, before I do that, is there anybody else who's recently come out of a course who might like to echo experiences? Oh, here we go.
So my name's Hannah Hibbert, and I'm from the Australian Turf Club in Sydney, New South Wales. I haven't finished my course quite so recently, but I did want to pick up on the point that you made about distinguishing yourself as a record keeper, which I think is fantastic, and I applaud you for that. But I just wonder, so I work in a corporate organisation and my job title is archivist. What I actually do is archiving, collection management, record keeping, exhibitions and displays, conservation, community engagement, the list goes on. So I just wonder if making those distinctions it's a good thing to do, but if you want to be able to expand your reach and possibility of employment, if there is value in saying, yes, I identify as a record keeper, but I know that I need to pick up these skills and look at these areas of perhaps study and understanding as well.
And I guess that connects with the previous comment there about the fact that, yes, because there are limited opportunities, you have to sort of not pigeonhole yourself. You have to sort of, and look to really leverage what you do. It's like, and have that broad and that specialisation as well too, particularly when you're starting off, when the opportunities you're dictated to by what's available rather than what you really want to do. And I think Kylie Percival made the point in the last session about that, you know, what's your current job versus what you really want to do, and how do you get yourself into a place where you're actually, you know what you're working towards. It's like picking up those skills along the way. Would you like to comment on having a range of, of different ways in which you can swing your... yeah.
Well, drawing back on my marketing background, I would say you could, within reason, choose whichever term suits the situation. When I'm strictly talking about something record keeping or archives, I tend to use those sort of words. But if it's more broadly information management or even just broader kind of transferable skills, I tend to use the term glamour, you know, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, record keeping. So sometimes there's merit in broadening it to show that you've got a diversity of skills, but if you're, say, in a meeting and it's specifically about a museum thing or specifically about a record-keeping thing, it's fine to go, well, I'm a record-keeping professional or I'm a museum professional, provided you've got, you know, a bit of knowledge or training to back that up. Yeah.
I guess, given the Angry Archivist title, do you ever use the record keeping to provoke people in your experience?
I work with a lot of IT professionals, and often to, you know, they could be dealing with a lot of data and they think, oh, well, we're not using that system anymore, we'll just get rid of it. And you usually have to be quite angry, and you usually have to bring in Public Record Office of Victoria, the word legal implications. And I do find that sometimes I do have to make the point, I'm the record-keeping expert in this room, and you need to follow what the advice. Now, I mean, I don't go in there all hardline all the time, because a lot of it's about building relationships with those same people. But often they'll be getting a lot of advice from a lot of different people, from project managers, from business analysts, from all sorts of, you know, people looking at, you know, the bottom line, how much is this going to cost us. So they're getting a whole lot of advice from people about how to run a particular, you know, system implication that has got record-keeping implications, and often we have to come in often and be quite specific in those contexts about who we are and what advice we're offering, because they'll be debating whether they need to follow disposal advice or not. So in my immediate context with tertiary education, I find sometimes I don't put on the record-keeping hat, depending on what kind of relationship I'm trying to build. But in other contexts, I find I do have to get a bit angry, and I do have to use that hat, and I can use it quite effectively to get what I think is often an understanding from them that it's okay, we do have to keep this, and we do have to work around it, or we do have to migrate that information, or we do have to do something, whereas before they would have just been focused on the costs. They're not thinking about it from an information strategy point of view, or what kind of potential risks they're leaving the university open to by not following those.
Just comment on that. I'm probably lucky I come at it from a different angle, in that somebody's paying me and bringing me in to do something to solve a problem or to help them make a decision. So, quite frankly, I don't really care what word I use if it makes sense to them in their context. And the context can be vastly different, from a massive global mining company to a small non-profit organisation. And so the question I would ask is, well, what have you brought me here for? It could be a compliance-based thing, and I've got some views about that. But if it's a state government department and there's been an Auditor General's report recently that says you need to be doing a whole lot of things to meet the standards that have been set out for you, which are very micro and prescriptive and very difficult to implement across an entire organisation, so they always fail. They brought me in to try and help them with that. That's fine. And they will take notice of what I provide, and I end up talking to boards, either boards or councils of an organisation or the Audit and Risk Committee, people like that. But equally, I've got another good example. It could be, thinking of the example we had before lunch, the IT people wanted to implement an add-on to an existing information system, which was a case management system. The system was working reasonably well, but they wanted to spend a lot more money on it. IT was saying, do this, do this, do this. And he said, you've done some work for us before in a different area. I'm really not sure about this. Can you come and have a look at it? Come and tell us what we need in terms of this system for record keeping, but in fact for a business compliance requirement, and what that would cost and what other processes we need to put in place, and is the technology just the solution, or other things we should be doing. And again, they picked up those recommendations because it's not just a tech solution. There's some behavioural changes that need to occur, there's some process changes that need to occur, there's some very clear practice changes that need to occur, and they're gradually going to put that through. So I'm in quite a different situation. Being an outsider is often an advantage, but equally they can take what you give them and stick it in a drawer, and so you never quite know.
And I guess it's that thing of leveraging that it's not when we talk systems, we're not just talking about technology, we're actually talking about people, process, technology coming together, and the records thing within that space. So to really use that as that point of professional distinction, it's like, and so to really leverage that in those kind of spaces. Yes, yeah. So I guess having heard the concerns from Susannah and Lydia about what it's like to starting off and being further along that career line. I think we had at the end, but let's not together. We're still young. So what advice would you give them as over the next few years as to how they should be developing as a professional and building their careers?
It's almost a Dorothy Dixer, because they know. But I think what I really try and do is try and get them out of the records area. Like, we work in a little unit, and it's quite a small unit within the IT division, and my real focus is getting them out into the rest of the organisation as much as possible. And I think that's a real, and they both do that very comfortably, and I think that's a real advantage to their careers. And they've both found different, Lydia in particular, you mentioned the hackathon, that's an actual full hardcore IT part of the e-solutions that get involved with a lot of technical people. And so for them to feel comfortable promoting what they do, but also listening to what other people do and building up those networks and relationships across the institution. And both of them are also very active in the professional organisations outside of work as well. So I think it's really encouraging them to be outward looking as well as being across their individual roles. And I do certainly encourage them. We are lucky in working in the universities. The university is quite, as long as we're compliant, they don't, with legislation and with Public Record Office, they don't necessarily process prescribers. So we've got ways of doing what we're doing to make sure we're relevant and making sure the institution's compliant, but they give us quite a lot of freedom in how we do that. So I do encourage both Lydia and Susannah to find what it is that they're really interested in and contribute in that way. So both of them have got those people skills and those wanting to engage directly with the client, so they get to do a lot of that. I've got other staff who are really interested in understanding more of the technical things, and they do more of that. So really encouraging them to take ownership of what it is they want to do in the profession and just supporting them with that.
Again, I think it's fortunate for people to be walking into that sort of role with a team and with a team leader, a manager that understands those requirements. Many archivist records managers don't have that luxury. For those that are on their own, it's really hard. So they leave university. Firstly, it's difficult getting a job. Mentoring's terrific. Continuing professional development in terms of training and professional association involvement. There's lots of volunteering. There's lots of things that you can do to get a leg in, to work in different organisations, get exposed to different situations, different corporate cultures, or organisational cultures rather, meet other people. So there's lots of opportunities there, but it's difficult for people who are on their own. And then even when they do get their first job, their expectations, and I think employer expectations, don't always align. And understanding organisations, I think, is critical, and that's why I think, and I'm biased because I've taught it, having professional practice as part of the course, I think, is absolutely essential. And you know, I'd encourage universities in this sort of area to do more of that, and even consider things like internships, which would go a bit longer, and give them more on-the-job training, experience in teams, experience with dealing with other information and non-information professionals to help create solutions, get exposure at high-level meetings that people take them to, and all the sorts of things that they wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to do on their own in their first job. So I think those sorts of things would be really useful as well.
Yeah, I guess in the importance of getting out there in all sorts of different ways is what we're hearing. It's like to really to see yourself as a professional who has a lot to contribute in lots of different ways, and to find the right mix, because we can't all do everything and we're all different personalities as well too. So to really be looking for, and sometimes it's not obvious what those things that you're most comfortable are, and so how do you be encouraged to do that? Or, I mean, really lucky to be in an environment where there is that encouragement, versus if you're not in that environment, then how do you seek that kind of those like-minded people that you can have those kind of conversations about. I mean, that's one of the things that happens with that Records Continuum research group get-together. It's just once a month when we can just go and just, you know, vent sometimes and just raise something in a sort of formal environment, and just have that sense that you're not alone, you're not battling something by yourself, you've got other like-minded people that you can sort of share that with. And I guess this is a professional conference where it's just so important to have those kinds of conversations, and to feel that it is a space, a safe enough space for us to sort of, talk and challenge each other as well too.
Can I just comment on something there? If I'm going to be, I'm never angry, never actually angry, except for those people that call you at 6 o'clock at night and tell you there's something wrong with your computer, ma'am, and you need to go up and we'll help you fix it. And then I let rip. But I get frustrated because I've been to some of other informal groups and get-togethers where they get together once every few months or whatever, and with the greatest of respect, it's a moan session. It's woe is me, woe are us, because no one will take notice of us, no one will listen to what we say, our advice is ignored, or we can't get a seat at the table. It's not how can we turn this around, what can we do, what can we contribute, and bless them. So many times at RIMPA events I've heard, I'm part of it, you know, I don't say this, but they say, we need marketing included in our courses, we need marketing. I think, have you seen Gruen, you know? I mean, it's not that. It's not selling yourself. It's advocacy is a different thing, but it's proving that you can add value. It's making those contacts, getting like-minded people, cultivating allies, having the conversation in areas where you're comfortable about having the conversation with what you can offer, using whatever language you need to use. I don't mean angry language, nice language. But it's adding value to what it is the organisation does, and I think we have to be better at doing that and showing our value in collaboration with others than complaining about it, which collectively our profession widely does a lot of, and I think we need to turn that around.
Yes, it's that, yes, there is thanks. There is yes, you do need to vent, but then you then need to use that as a positive thing to move forward and not get stuck in a cycle of just being angry.
Hello, fellow Monash people. I just wanted to share with everybody in the room about an experience that I had last year. I was living in the States for a couple of years, and I went to an ARMA event, and it was called Defensible Deletion, and it was run by a lawyer who's also an educator. And the conversation you were just having, and as it's been evolving, it just made me think of that event. I went and spoke to him, and he was all like, "Oh, in Australia you're so fabulous, and you do all these fabulous things." And but the thing that made me think about is that every single person in that room was either an accountant or a lawyer, and they were there for an ARMA event on defensible deletion. And there was no one in the room that called themselves an archivist. And we know in the US they do separate records management quite significantly to archives. But there was a different conversation going on. And I'm just teaching at the moment about the OAIS model and the idea that it has a different independent language. Although the language is confusing, but that's a side story. But, a different independent language separate from records or archives or conventional kinds of language to do that with that. And I do wonder if that, this marketing issue, which I agree, Judith, is, it's not necessarily that kind of... We don't need to keep advocating for our voice. We just need to talk in the right way, because one of the things they mentioned at that ARMA conference, they had a thing up there, an infographic. He'd done some research, and there was like 9 different departments that he had to deal with, and a lot of them were data related, and understanding what the context of a record is in a database and all of these kinds of things. You actually have to go to them and talk their language and have an understanding. And I think that in education, certainly at Monash when I went through, we got that. We got that kind of understanding of how to read standards and that kind of thing, so we could have a conversation with people. And that's really, really important, to go where the conversation's happening.
Any comments from our panel on this? Is, I guess, Judith, you're in that position where you're dealing a lot with talking to non-record keeping people about big record keeping issues. It's like, and yes.
But I think it's interesting what you. I think it's interesting what you say about. I do sometimes come across professionals who have that mindset of, oh, they're not listening to me, and I think I find it interesting because, in my experience, I get listened to a fair bit, I believe, and I think that when I go out and speak to someone for a consultation, because we give record keeping advice, we don't really do much record keeping. We mostly give advice to everyday staff in how to manage their information and their records in a way that's compliant but effective. And I put effective on the end there because I could technically tick some boxes and go and say, put everything in trim, that's probably going to be compliant. But I make sure that when I meet with someone that I'm asking a bit more about what they do and how they do it. And in one example, to help get the committee records into a good compliant record keeping system, an EDRMS, they actually needed training in how best to compile their agenda and papers, because it's very convenient if it's in one PDF just to pop it in the EDRMS. And they had this weird thing with all different attachments, and some were embedded in Word documents and things. So I find that actually if I go out there and I give them some advice on solving some of their effective problems of how to manage everything and get, say, an agenda in a suitable format to just send out to people, the record keeping's just a really easy thing at the end. So I think if you're having those conversations about no one's listening to me, I'm not getting any buy-in, is there any way that you can tweak how you're going in? Because I actually find that I get listened to a fair bit.
Add to that often when we're in a big institution and we have a lot of clients, if we think about the whole of the university staff, and often I will prioritise. If there's people that will listen, we'll give them the advice that they want. And there's people that don't listen, and I'll say, well, they go to the bottom of the list, and I don't really keep up at night worrying about it, because at the end of the day, it's exactly what Lydia says. We go out there and we provide what is relevant, what gets their problem solved, and often record keeping is seen as a big part of it, but it's not necessarily the whole service, and we don't market it in that way. We're there to help, and we don't even always focus on compliance either. Sometimes we focus on how can we make this so that you're more business efficient, or how can we make this so that you're not having to go through 5 different systems to find what it is that you want. And no, you don't have to put everything into TRIM, because you're using 2 other systems already. How can we'll check that for records compliance. We'll check that, we'll do that for you, and then we'll say that your system has got some risks, this is what you need to be aware of, but then that's the end of it. And people appreciate that. They'll come back to you because you've given them something useful that they can do.
Yes. Keeping me on my toes.
I teach in the North American context, and more and more there's an expectation that we could teach, in the world of data curation, which is a little bit complicated because you have to teach not just the preservation of content and the infrastructure behind that preservation, but also understanding the domain knowledge that produced that data, right? So if it's a climatologist, you have to know the language of climatology. If it's physics, then you have to understand physics. If it's biochemistry, it has to be about biochemistry. If it's social science data, then you have to know the particular social science that produced that data. And it's all because you want to encourage data reuse. And I just wonder if that particular way of thinking around, is even an expectation among your students or the professions here.
I suppose, is there a comment on that from Lydia? Did you do the Data in Society new unit at Monash? Yes.
I did.
Yes.
Yeah. It actually wasn't what I was expecting it to be, so I'm not sure how much I should say. And I may have misread the synopsis of the unit, because I think from the title of it and the quick synopsis I had read, I had thought that I would be learning some really technical skills and a more practical understanding of how things like big data and data analytics work.
So kind of the data curation
that
Ricky was talking about.
That is what I was expecting. It ended up being quite different, but it's not a criticism as such, because it was a very interesting unit, but it was more about things like privacy compliance and privacy considerations for data management, and there were all sorts of, that was one I think where there was a week on copyright and a week on privacy and things. So it was a very interesting unit, gave me a really good grounding in a lot of the other areas that record keeping touches on or intersects with. But actually, coming back to one of the first questions we had, one of the potential limitations of the course is that I'm not sure we get enough from a course about understanding the technical side. So one of my favourite units, even though it nearly broke my brain, was the databases unit. Because I'm a humanities person. I majored in philosophy and history, and I wrote an honours thesis on Reformation history and women's rights and things. So when the first unit I did for the course was databases, because I was curious to learn more technical things. And it does help me understand how to do my job better. So I would like to see a little bit more of that in the course. You don't have to become an expert in it, but in learning a little bit about how to create, SQL codes and data tables and stuff, it helps me understand more why things are designed a certain way or function a certain way.
And has that also helped being in an environment where you're sitting within eSolutions, which is an IT area? Does it actually help in kind of having that connection with people and that relationship building, because you kind of know a little bit about what they've been studying to get where they are?
And it helps with the vocab as well, as in we're experts in record keeping and archiving. We're not experts in something like databases. But if we know even just what SQL codes are, or a little bit about how they're structured, and we can demonstrate that by just popping a little bit of vocab in, just to sort of like name dropping. I think that it helps our credibility, that they know that we know a little bit about them, and they probably don't know much about us, so I think it might raise our standing. So.
Yeah, I actually had something happen a couple of weeks ago where one of the people from our tech team called me up and was just like, oh, can you guys actually do, I think it was something like reopening a closed student file or something. She's like, by the SQL code, you can't do it. I'm like, oh no, we can definitely do that. And she's like, I'm like, I can actually visualise it as well.
You can connect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Judith, you were going to say something?
Just a cast-off comment. When you're talking about being in these solutions, again, it's a very fortunate position to be in. I know of archivists and records managers who are in the property and facilities department. Go figure, you know. I mean, it's all about storage and boxes. They have nothing to do with digital systems, and they get asked for advice about dealing with the old stuff, and things get sent their way that people don't know what to do with it. This exists. I mean, those traditional legacy structures and mindsets still exist, and that's why we need to hold hands across information, knowledge, industry professionals, and make the changes together. I think you can't do it alone, I would say.
I was just going to add there, what Judith's saying is that we are fortunate to be in eSolutions, and it's not just the records management unit, it's the archives unit as well. Now they do, Jan's not here, Jan gets the archives manager's not here to talk herself, but I know sometimes she does sometimes feel she is in a very, very environment that does not understand her, but at the same time, to give eSolutions credit, they're very quick to promote what the archives are doing. So they take a lot of pride in, like, the photographs, the archives photographs. They do promote also the advice that the archives can give them, particularly with legacy systems. So they're very aware within eSolutions that they have this expertise, and even in moments where there's been a lot of restructuring and so forth going on, and we've even said, well, is there somewhere else that they want to put us in, because that often happens in organisations, and eSolutions are from the very top, adamant that they want our expertise in with them, because they see it as valuable to what they're doing. So I think even from the archives perspective, it is an unusual sometimes place for the archives to be, but that allows us to work together really closely, and I mean, I know that Lydia and Susannah benefit from having that advice, and that they'll go in and do some of the work, and then the archive staff will go in and do some of the work, and we interchange. So often, the archive staff will go out with these guys doing internal audits, because they want to understand what some of the risks are to be with the future records, the electronic records. So, and vice versa. So I think that works really well. But kudos to eSolutions for doing it that way.
Slight side note, but even when I enrolled in the Monash course, I was like, oh, what am I doing in Faculty of IT? I'm not supposed to be here. This is a really bad idea. And then once you finally got into it, you're like, oh, yes, okay, I understand now. Yeah, we do fit.
Hi. I've been lucky to be working as a consultant for the last few years, and one of the things I've sort of observed is that a lot of the records people I've had to deal with in organisations are trying to suggest solutions to problems in a very rigid way. And I guess one of the things, I had the experience in a New South Wales agency when I was working with Barbara Reid, and we were looking at a new IT system that was being designed, and the IT manager, who was very sceptical about it, us being in there, we'd been brought in by the CEO, said, don't give us a solution, tell us what you want, what the standards are that we need to meet, what are the requirements. Don't try and come up with a solution, we'll come up with a solution. And it kind of has stuck with me is that one of the things I think we need to really sort of focus on in education is the principles behind what we're doing, not so much the solutions of the practices, because whenever you look at standards, legislation, they're incredibly complicated. A lot of the standards around, particularly the government ones, there's 120 requirements you've got to meet, but when it boils down to it, I looked at some recently and I reckon I could get it down to about 16 that were essential. And it's really understanding the intent behind that standard, not that this is the way it has to be implemented. So I think if we can keep coming back to what are we trying to achieve, what's the intent of these standards, and focus on those rather than perhaps the solutions all the time, and let other people who are perhaps better at designing the solutions come up with those.
You must have seen our sheet because you're segueing nicely into the next question. But I think Judith's got something to say about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. At the ISO level, we're in the process of developing a standard on, I can't remember the exact name, but it's record keeping and information architecture. And I take Frank's point from the session before lunch that even those models and tactics are already out of date. But at the moment, it's the best we've got to work with, and at the moment, we're not working with them at all. But what this standard does is exactly what you said, Tony. It's not trotting out all our, requirements, all 5 million of them. It's saying these are the core principles that we have in our domain. We don't worry too much about using records or record-keeping language, but it's a way of our language intersecting with, or our meaning intersecting with that of information architects and conveying to them our core principles, which we would like them to build into their architectures and systems and methods of implementation. And to do that work, we've involved a lot of information architects from across the globe in developing that standard. It's come together pretty well. Yeah.
I just want to say more on a practical, on the ground level, I would totally agree in that with a project I'm working on at the moment, which is, I guess, it's called data lifecycle. But that's the IT guys' term, and they've come to us with unstructured data and said, we've got capacity problems. So my advice to them is about addressing their capacity problems. So even though as a record keeper I might look at it from a risk management perspective and let's go in and try and mine out, this is talking about file shares and things where there could be records, they're not any sort of structure. I might be actually in the back of my mind interested in that and from, let's get those out and focus on there. But they're actually dealing with servers that are at capacity and having to move things into the cloud, and they're saying, well, what can you do to help us with this problem? So in those situations, I'm really just focusing on addressing their needs, but then they see it as they've been given, they do conceptualise it being given record keeping advice, but they don't see it as being having to follow a set of rules and so forth. They're seeing as being somebody that's come in and actually helped them with a practical problem that they're dealing with at the moment. And then later on, the executives in ESOLs will say, yes, we'll spend more money now on getting you the tools you need to do the risk management side, but you've done us the big favour of dealing with some of those capacity issues, so we'll include you in the conversation going forward. So often I'm juggling those two things. What my professional hat might be seeing as more of a priority, I will juggle it based on the situations and where I think I can get the most buy-in and what it ultimately benefits the institution.
And I guess I was heartened by what Lydia was saying there about, how it's not about going in and saying, follow these rules and regulations, but really actually working out, what's going to be effective in that situation. So I think, yes, hopefully, well, from both the course and the experience that people bring to the course, that is the kind of people that, that's the kind of, when you come out, that you feel you can operate in that kind of way, and that's great. So the segue is that principles and perhaps asking a question about the way that understanding of the conceptual frameworks that inform where we are, where we'd like to be, things like post-custodial records continuum, archival multiverse. So I'm going to ask each of the panel to just say how do you see and use those concepts in your practice? Yeah. Maybe I'll start with...
Yeah. Well, I have the advantage there in that I've got, a bit of years behind me, so and I'm also doing my PhD, so I have revisited a lot of articles from the Care Mission upward to, reframe how I'm thinking. But I think I see, on a practical level, I see two things happening. The first one, I think, is really dealing with the multiple voices when we're looking at record keeping. One of the biggest ones in the university context is, of course, student records, and often we're engaged with conversations about how those records are being maintained, and often very predominantly it's the institution's view of those. So it's the holder of the truth, and what it collects is considered that's the authority. And so having conversations with a lot of those users now, or those people that are running those systems now, to say, how are you accommodating the students' perspective? And some of that are practical things like Lydia's mentioned about privacy and things like that, because sometimes when they're doing data mining or doing other things, the focus is on a different element and not necessarily considering how they're reusing data that may, and how it's being, you know, kept blind and all of those sort of things. But also just from the point of view of how much information they're collecting. Sometimes there's a need to collect a lot of information that when I say to them, how would you feel if that was being collected about you, they start to wind it back a little bit and think maybe we don't need to keep all of that really, you know, sensitive stuff for this purpose. So I feel those are giving me really, and those kind of conversations are really, coming back to the gentleman there's point of view, it's interesting for the client. Like, you know, if I sit down and put up a whole lot of standards on a slide, I'll lose my audience, you know, my internal audience. But whereas I get them to think about some of those questions, again, it's implementing record keeping theory, but in a way that they don't they're not getting bored and falling off their chair. You know, they're going, oh yeah, how would I think about that? Oh, I wouldn't feel comfortable with it. A number of them said, I would not want that stuff on my record. And I'm saying, so what the hell are you doing putting it on the other student's record? The other side of it I find interesting as well is this idea where we do sort of now, I think, are really moving away from just, as professionals, just promoting a trim. So I'd say to the lady at the back, you know, don't lose hope, because I think even if you haven't necessarily been trained in trim, I don't see that as be-all and end-all at all, because really there's so many other systems. In the case of the university loves a system. I'm sure government does too, but universities really love a system. And there's new ones all the time, and so we're having to adjust from being really probably even 4 or 5 years ago, it was all about trim. It was all about getting everything into trim and registry and all of that. Now that's all by the wayside. We just provide the advice, and we're really dealing with, well, how do we get involved in these conversations? And I mentioned earlier we do record keeping assessments. We've boiled that down to about four or five questions, which people are quite happy to engage with, because they see it as being a safeguard. So one of the ones, an example we said, well, who can delete things in this system? And they came back and said, oh, actually, anyone can. And we don't really want that. So they then revisited and got the vendor to change things. So then it became actually record-keeping compliant. But as far as they were concerned, it was just common sense. It was just something, an angle they hadn't actually considered. And once they understood the implications, they again weren't thinking of it as a record-keeping risk. They were thinking it of as just a risk. And so I think for us, it's getting involved in that idea that the record can exist anywhere, in any system, and instead of us trying to chase every record and put it into one system, we're doing things like record keeping assessments of systems to say, yes, you can use that, and these are things you have to think about, but also doing audits. But we treat those as both stick and carrot. We do them as educational, but often we're getting into the conversation, into the room, where we can make a difference because it's in conjunction with our internal audit, and so it has the authority for us to go in. And we started doing it by faculties and doing it like that, but now we're actually focusing on types of systems. So we're doing student systems at the moment, which again is really revealing the breadth of the way that records are being captured and where they're being captured, and they're getting out of just one system. They're existing across, you know, multiple systems, and we're having to track that. And that's that to me is where this theory is really useful, because we don't have to sort of, a lot of IT people can get stuck and think, oh, if it's not in the one system, you know, we'll just say, no, maybe you've got an interface and you can have all of those systems, as long as they're all compliant. You're not having randoms delete things. But yeah, those are the sort of conversations we feel equipped to have.
I guess it's the cascade of inscriptions that Frank was talking about in the session previously. And I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but when Cath started her PhD and said, well, go back and read the Continuum stuff, it's like after being in the profession for 10, 15 years, suddenly it's like, oh, that just makes so much sense. It's like, yes.
It's changed. I mean, it's that thinking that has allowed me to reflect and then change the dynamic of the program. I mean, I had to change it anyway because we were becoming irrelevant if we just focused on a registry servicing 3 or 4 clients of the uni with trim. That was never going to be a long-term plan. But it was reflecting on the readings and then going, well, how do I apply this to what I'm dealing with now? And it all became a lot more easier. But it does help the fact that I've had that training first up and then quite a significant amount of time in the field, and then this opportunity to come back and read and reflect again. And I know that's a luxury that I've created for myself, and my institution is supportive of that. But that's the journey where I can sit back and say, right, I'm going to change the whole program, and that's what we've effectively done. But a lot of it comes from that initial reading stuff that I've revisited. And kudos to Frank.
Judith. I agree with Cath entirely, and yes, ask the questions rather than give them technical recordsy solutions. And all those points you made, I agree with 100%. I think the concepts that you mentioned, I think all highly useful, highly relevant, but poorly applied. And I think there's probably 2 issues with that. One, in a government context, I think, is our peak records and archives offices. This isn't angry, it's just a bit frustrating. In the past, I'll say in the past, have adopted all those ways of thinking for all the right reasons, and they're all fabulously trained or educated, but then produce overly prescriptive standards and rules and methods that then often are very difficult, if not impossible, to apply. And there's been a lot of revision of that, actually, in very recent years for all those reasons. And I think another barrier, I guess, is Lisa mentioned the distinction between archivists and records managers, and archives and records management in the US is still firmly entrenched here as well in many, many organisations. I keep coming back to this thing about, across the different information knowledge management professionals. Legacy practice and attitudes mitigates against trying to do the sorts of things that you're doing creatively and brilliantly. And where you've got traditional people doing traditional things and the culture is such that it's embedded, it's hard to change, and management see that, and the organisation treats people in those roles in that way and they can't find a way out of it, it just doesn't go away. Because the model's just, you can't discuss that sort of thing in those types of organisations. You've got to find other ways of doing it by stealth. And in a way, that's, if you like, what you're doing, which is fine. But if you're on your own, or running a small team with just day-to-day operational chaos going on around you, you don't have the luxury of being able to do that. But there's obviously huge opportunities in a digital world to be applying all of this in all sorts of wonderful ways. We just have to find the right ways of doing it.
Well, that's actually a good segue to Lydia, because you've been involved with a project around that information culture side of things with Gillian. So perhaps you might comment on how that has a research dimension to the project, so how that's helped with practice.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the information culture work that Gillian Oliver and Fiorella Froscarini worked on, and I was lucky enough to have exposure to it, both being able to read the articles and the book about it, but also Cath, being my manager, was working on a research project using it, and I had some exposure to it through that, and it just really, really resonated with me. And I can't say enough how important it is to make that more widely available and used. There is, with information culture, there's a book that explains like a methodology and a way that you can approach things to try and understand what your information culture is. And it really stresses that every single workplace has an information culture. So information culture can mean all sorts of things. It can be a secretive one or a really open one. They might be really good at some record keeping, like finance is often really robust because they've got other mandates for it. But then another area they might just have no clue as far as we're concerned. So for me, I find the information culture really interesting because it gives you a framework and literally a toolkit. It's available for free online in about 5 different languages to help you start to tease out what your information culture is. And that's sort of the first step to understanding how to run a more effective record-keeping program. And even though there is a toolkit that you can use, for me, it's almost become like a mindset or an attitude that I'm always coming back to just flipping the usual typical thinking of, so I'm not walking in going, oh, why aren't they doing what I told them to do? Like, which unfortunately we still hear quite a bit, and I almost catch myself doing sometimes. It's stop and listen first, try and find out from them, well, why do you do it that way? And, you know, I've noticed that this is going on. Tell me a bit more about that. And what do you think about this? And if you actually stop and listen and ask all the questions first and take down some notes and do a bit of reflective thinking, it really is eye-opening for maybe why things aren't going the way that you would like them to go or you would think. And it's actually quite confronting, because I might go in thinking, I'm going to find out why they're not doing it my way. And then I'm going to use my marketing skills and sales skills and trick them or stealth to find out how to get them to do what I want them to do. But what you actually find out when you go through that process, it can be quite confronting, that you can learn that maybe the way you're approaching it or the way you wanted to do it isn't necessarily the best way or the only way. There's a good example. I've had a little bit of exposure to Agile project methodology, and it's come up, I think, this morning as well in some of the discussions, and my immediate thought was, oh my gosh, Agile is terrible for record keeping. They don't keep very good records with it, and they see records as blockers. And then when I asked Gillian about it, she said, well, have you thought about what you could learn as a record keeper from the way that the Agile project methodology does things? I'm like, whoa, I'd never thought of what can I learn from them. So I think it opens up more of a two-way dialogue, and I think it's very effective, and I think it's the future of record keeping and information culture. Well, it comes back to the talk this morning about record keeping informatics. It's one of the components of that. But I think the challenge is you have to be really open and self-reflective to it, and that can be quite confronting.
And Susannah, any thoughts about how the conceptual, very recent conceptual reading and thinking you've been doing plays out in your job?
I feel like I'm going to massively contradict myself, because I feel like I know the theory and I understand it, but don't actually understand it at the same time. I remember when we first got introduced to the records continuum and just going, oh, what is this? And then having to write a little assignment on it, and our lecturer said, if you think you can understand records continuum after a 2-hour lecture, you don't get it. I was like, okay, thank God. Yeah, but even just the info culture stuff has been fantastic. Same thing, had a client, and they were a little bit reluctant to be using it. I think they had been dumped with a whole heap of, someone must have left or something had happened around there, and understanding why they wanted to do it the way they wanted to do it. I was like, yep, that's going to work perfectly. Lydia's like, yes, we're happy to go that way. And they're more likely to actually get on board with records and everything like that if we go, yep, you're going in the right direction, you're doing what we want, and that's good. Yes.
Yes. I think you've all demonstrated there one of the issues that we were going. The next question, segueing beautifully here, which was around that issue which was mentioned in the previous session by Kylie on the value of being that reflective practitioner. It's like to be always reflecting on what you're learning in the process as well too. I guess, yes, how are we going for time? We've got about 15 minutes left, so perhaps, to get your thoughts on what strategies would you like to see to support that reflective practice? From, I guess, Cath and Judith's perspective, now that you know, what would you like to see?
Yeah. In terms of reflective?
Yeah.
Well, I guess we've discussed before, but one of the things that we're involved in these solutions is they've got a particular management framework which involves you having to do compulsory team meetings every week, and it's like it's non-negotiable. Every team has to have a team meeting every week. Now, we're a very small group, and there's only so many operational things that we can use in that time. So one of the things we do is we tend to have every second one, or at least one a month, where we'll actually go, okay, we're going to use this to have I won't say, it's not like peace and harmony, hold hands and sing songs, reflective moment. It's more that usually it comes from Lydia or maybe one of the others, where they'll have been to an event and they'll just do a couple of slides of the key things they've taken away from a professional event, and we'll then have a bit of a discussion. And I've got staff members who haven't had any formal qualification. They wouldn't have read any of the eminent articles or anything like that, but they will really engage with having what is probably a reflective session, but we don't call it that. It's a team meeting. But it's very valuable, because from that we'll then come out of it and say, there's some ideas that we can actually use. So I get that in the past I would have found that very difficult to try and incorporate in the busy day-to-day. I get that. But it's trying to use existing structures. Like, we have to have this meeting anyway, rather than just sitting and chatting about anything. We kind of structure it so that we can have a bit of that. And I mean, it's great having these two that have come out of the course, because they're very keen to do that sort of discussion. But as I said, I've got staff who have come out of traditional registry background who are equally keen to get involved by having those talks. And that's a kind of a simple way that we incorporate that sort of thing.
I guess for operational staff it is difficult. I've got no time to do this. I've got 3,000 other things to do. If you are a project manager, you have every opportunity to do that, and should be, and I think most are that I've seen, because they've got to make their project work as well as report higher up the food chain, account for time and costs and resources and so on. If you're implementing a new system or a new way of doing things, in my experience, yes, people in those sorts of... It depends on role and context is what I'm getting at. So if you're an implementer or in an implementation team, you do that quite regularly. Any sort of analyst has to do it. If you've been asked to put a business case or something like that together, you do it. I'm fortunate, of course, in my role, I have to do it all the time, because I'm brought in to solve problems or make improvements, and so I've got to do a lot of consultation, talk to people about, well, how do you do this and why, and so on, and come up with ideas and options for improvement that involve a lot of that reflection. Reflection in terms of what's best for the organisation in its context and with its culture generally, and its information culture, and reflection in terms of how I can apply my conceptual and practical learnings and knowledge and understanding.
And that being things even like practical things like lessons learnt,
Absolutely.
Documents, yes. Things like that, because that is a common part of the project.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like the idea of the reflective practice, and even from other industries I've worked in. I mean, my very first job was doing sales and marketing for the fitness industry, and it was a very performance-based culture, and if you weren't getting a certain number of sales per hour, you were out the door. And so in order to keep our sales rate up, we had a lot of retraining and like role-playing, like it was a call centre and face-to-face sales, so you had a lot of how did that one go? And so I think from my very first career in a whole different profession and industry, I was sort of trained up that you should always be, after each appointment, how did that go? Reflect on that. What can you learn? What can you do better? So I really like that in the ASA's professional capabilities matrix, that one of the ones is critical reflection. I'm not sure why it's on the end of the list. It's not in alphabetical order, so I don't know if there is a ranking there. But I think that, look, I'm a new professional. I am new to record keeping and archives, but I've come to it from, almost 15 years of work experience and various other qualifications. And I'm convinced that a lot of the challenges that we have in record keeping and archives, particularly in getting the seat at the table at the right meetings and getting people on board and helping people, I think if we did more critical reflection, we'd very quickly turn that ship around, or at least start to. because some things we do really well, but I think some things we don't do as well. I'm saying quite cautiously. And I'm sure if we're all being more reflective, maybe we'd be able to, in a fairly not too confronting way, start to address some of that.
Susanna? Yeah.
I don't think I have really much else to add. I feel like it's because I'm so brand new, everything is still so reflective in its own kind of right, yeah.
It's interesting to think that, yes, as a new person, you're just continually asking that question of what do I know, what do I don't know, and how does it fit together? It's like, so don't lose that. It's like, I think that's probably the thing to do. And I guess, I mean, the examples that you've given there are very much like, yes, it's reflective practice within the work context, but it's probably also, which I think segues into another of our questions, it's like, what are the ways in which the professional associations could kind of help both with that reflective practice, but I guess in general that continuing professional development side of things, because we've said that, you know, a year's course is not enough. It's like it gets you started, but it's the on-the-job stuff which is going to keep you going. But it's more than that, as you can see from Cath and Judith's experiences, that you've got to be also framing that. So what ways could professional associations sort of encourage and support that professional development? So I might start... Judith, I'll start with Judith's bit.
Well, many of them have CPD schemes of all the different associations that I'm in. Some are much better than others. A lot of it's self-assessment. Even when you do the self-assessment, there's one very, very good association I'm part of that never checks that, whether you've done it or not and whether you've met their points requirement. And the other one checks vigorously and says that certain people aren't even allowed to be members of the board because they haven't filled out their latest silly spreadsheet. It wasn't me. How do you fill mine out? And some of the criteria are a bit iffy, like attending meetings, you know, I don't really know if that quite cuts it. So I think you need very clear criteria with something like a CPD scheme about what it is you're actually wanting people to achieve, and having something that's actually accessible, you know, by the person or the organisation. And I think even in the matrix, there's some things that would be very, very difficult to assess, really. So you've got to be realistic about it. But I think professional associations can do other things too. I mean, obviously holding all sorts of events and roundtable discussions. The New South Wales Roundies group is really good, and professional associations should be hooking into things like that. Not necessarily reproducing what the other one does and wheeling the same speakers around. Mentoring, I think, would be really helpful and useful, and I know that ASA is doing it, tried it.
Well, yes, I think that was one of the things we probably wanted to talk to. Because I know when I started in the profession in the mid to late 90s, there was a mentoring scheme around. And I think what you've heard here is some examples of some formal and informal mentoring, but I think perhaps one of the things we wanted to draw out here, and Lydia might like to say something about this, is what a mentoring scheme would mean for a new professional.
And I must say, the only reason I'm literally here today speaking at the ASA conference, which I'm still really, really honoured to be on the program, is through mentoring and a lot of advice and guidance and encouragement from a lot of people, and particularly from my manager, Cath, driving the point home that mentoring is really important. So she guides me a lot, but she also encourages me to seek out other guidance as well. And a point I'd like to make is that I've noticed that particular professional organisations may have mentoring programs, but I'm not sure that they're offering it in the way that would resonate best with new professionals. And I would like to see more opportunities for what I kind of call pop-up mentoring or mini mentoring. And there's a quote where someone had said, you know, you shouldn't just have one mentor, you should have a team of mentors. So I'd like to with the reflective practice thing, get people to think about the current model that seems to be doing the rounds is that traditional, you get somebody to take you under their wing and they guide you for life, and not to discount that that's not very valuable and effective and available to some people. But what I'd like to see is more learning from each other, peer mentoring, mentoring from other people. I've found that within reason, if you reach out to quite senior people, as long as you're quite specific about what you're wanting advice in and what you're expecting, and it's not too much of a burden on their time or their energy, I found people to be very generous with their advice and the small amount of time that I am requesting. So what I'd like to see is mentoring programs that are more time specific and really geared towards some really clear-cut outcomes. You know, you pick from a list of 10 of 3 to 5 things you want to focus on, you get matched up with someone who believes they have something to offer in that space, and it's got a strict time period around it. I'd like to see more of that. And what I'd like to see more of also, I had someone say a while back that maybe some of the reasons that sometimes membership drops at the moment in certain professional organisations is that everything's online and everything's free, and, you know, that's why things aren't working. But I don't think that that's correct. I don't think there's much online, and I don't think there's much free, and I think it's really valuable to be able to have face-to-face conversations, or at least email or Skype sort of exchanges. And I think I'd like to see a lot more pop-up events, networking opportunities, face-to-face things, more opportunities to learn throughout the year. There's so much that professional organisations could offer, but to be honest, with the amount of money that I've paid at times at my own expense and other times at my company's expense, I'm not sure I'm getting enough back, and I don't want to be all like, oh, you've got to do it all for me. I understand that you've got to create your own opportunities, but the other thing I'd really, really like to see is more space for people to be able to create their own leadership opportunities, because there are times when I may have tried to get something off the ground in a certain environment that just wasn't conducive to a new professional coming along and starting something. So trust that new professionals, we are new, we do need guidance and advice, but we have a lot to offer, and we have a lot of transferable skills in sales and customer service and marketing, and we want to engage, but sometimes we want to engage in a way that's a little bit different